The smell of bacon curling in a cast iron pan and the hiss of a kettle on a coal range once marked the rhythm of Britain's working day. These weren't fancy meals, but hearty plates that turned scraps into survival, and by the end you'll taste them again in your memory. Bubble and squeak. Why on earth is it called bubble and squeak? The name actually comes from the sound it makes in the pan, the bubbling potatoes and squeaking cabbage as they fry together. Born in the age of thrift, this dish was the perfect way to use Sunday roast leftovers. Potatoes, cabbage, maybe a scrap of meat if you were lucky. Fried up until golden, crisp on the outside and soft within. For the working man, bubble and squeak meant nothing went to waste. In cramped kitchens, mothers scraped pans clean, pressing every crumb into the mix. Families gathered round chipped plates, steam rising, and laughter cutting through the cold of ration-era winters. Today it lingers as a quirky pub side or a nostalgic nod in cookbooks. But in its heyday, it was more than just fried veg. It was proof that working-class Britain could turn scraps into tradition. Back then, leftovers weren't shameful. They were a meal worth remembering. Shepherd's pie. Few meals speak to the British heart like shepherd's sardines pie. Minced lamb simmered with onions, carrots and peas, all tucked beneath a thick blanket of mashed potato. Baked until the peaks browned and crisped, it emerged from the oven as a working man's feast. Its origins lie in the 18th century, when thrifty households layered leftover roasted meat with vegetables, sealing it with potatoes, cheap, filling and reliable. For miners, factory workers and shipbuilders, a plate of shepherd's pie meant fuel to face another grueling day. Children scraped forks across the crust, diving into the savoury warmth beneath. Mothers stretched a single pound of meat to feed a family of 6. It wasn't gourmet, it was survival with a touch of love. Today you'll still find it on pub menus, but its magic lies in memory. Shepherd's pie was never just about eating. It was about gathering, sharing and knowing that however hard the work, there'd be warmth waiting at the table. Steak and kidney pudding. Dense, hearty, unapologetically British, steak and kidney pudding was the working man's luxury. Suet pastry wrapped around chunks of beef, diced kidney, onions and thick gravy, steamed for hours until rich and tender. For dock workers and coal miners, this dish was more than food. It was armour. After a day in cold, damp conditions, nothing restored strength like a slice of pudding steaming on the plate. It filled the stomach and quieted the hunger that bread alone could never touch. The dish dates back to the 19th century, when puddings weren't sweet but savoury, born from necessity and craft. Suet, cheap, plentiful and calorie-dense, was the key. Add in offal, and you had a meal that wasted nothing. Though it's fallen out of everyday fashion, those who remember know its power. Steak and kidney pudding wasn't pretty, but it was honest. Every bite told the story of men who worked with their hands and the kitchens that kept them going. Beans on toast, simple, humble, yet iconic. A can of Heinz beans poured over buttered toast has fed more Britons than any fancy roast. For the working man, it was the quickest comfort, cheap, filling, and always reliable. In post-war Britain, tins of baked beans became a household staple. Factories churned them out, grocers stacked them high, and families depended on their steady warmth. For men heading off to early shifts, beans on toast was a 5-minute breakfast that stuck to the ribs. For kids, it was the after-school tea that felt like a hug. It carried no pretense, no ceremony, just toast, bean sands, and maybe a sprinkle of cheese if payday had been kind. Some might sneer at its simplicity, but for millions it was the taste of home. Today, beans on toast has become a symbol, a shorthand for British working-class resilience. Because sometimes the best meals aren't grand, they're the ones that simply get you through. Corned beef hash. Open a tin of corned beef, chop up some potatoes, fry it all together until it crackles, and you've got a dish that defined decades of working-class life. Corned beef hash was the meal of ration books, post-war kitchens, and paydays stretched thin. The canned beef, imported from Argentina during the war, became a staple long after victory was declared. Cheap, salty, and shelf-stable, it mixed with fried onions and diced potatoes into something greater than the sum of its parts. For many working men, corned beef hash was the meal that waited after the pub. Hot, greasy, and comforting, it soaked up the cold nights and long hours. Children would spear crispy bits straight from the pan, mothers stretching tins to feed crowds. Though it's faded from dinner tables today, its memory lingers in the smell of sizzling spuds and the metallic snap of a corned beef key tin. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. a working-class classic born from necessity. Lancashire hot pot, a dish born from the mills and mines of northern England. Lancashire hot pot was the slow-cooked comfort of the working man. Thin slices of lamb or mutton, onions and carrots were layered beneath a topping of potatoes, baked until the edges crisped and the centre bubbled with rich gravy. In the 19th century, while men worked long hours in textile factories, women prepared the hot pot in heavy earthenware dishes. Left in the oven for hours, it cooked low and steady, ready when the day's labour ended. Cheap cuts of meat and simple vegetables made it both affordable and filling. Children came home to the smell drifting through narrow terrace streets. Families crowded in around the table, steam rising as the lid was lifted. It was warmth, nourishment, and community all in one dish. Though it's now seen as old-fashioned, Lancashire hot pot remains a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in hard times, patience and simplicity could produce something unforgettable. Meat and potato pie, golden crust, steaming filling, holy. Meat and potato pie was the backbone of the working class table. Minced beef, diced potatoes, onions and thick gravy, sealed inside short crust pastry that crumbled under the fork. Bakeries across the north sold them by the dozen. A quick lunch for mill workers, miners and builders. Wrapped in paper, eaten with hands still rough from work, it was fuel in its purest form. At home, mothers baked large trays stretching small amounts of meat with extra potatoes so no one went hungry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. You knew exactly what you were getting, but sorry, no tricks, no fuss. Just rich gravy, hearty starch and a crust that kept the cold out. Today you'll still find them in chip shops and football stadiums, a taste of tradition clutched in mittened hands. Meat and potato pie wasn't just a meal. It was a piece of Britain's working identity, baked golden and shared by all. Kippers. If you grew up near the coast, you'll remember the smoky tang of kippers frying in the pan. Split, salted and smoked herring, these oily fish were the breakfast of working men who needed energy for the day ahead. Cheap and plentiful, kippers became a staple in fishing towns and beyond. Factory workers and shipbuilders ate them before dawn shifts, their sharp aroma filling cramped kitchens. Served with bread, butter, or even a splash of vinegar, they were simple but sustaining. For many children, the smell was unforgettable, loved by some, dreaded by others. It clung to clothes, to curtains, to memory, yet it carried with it the strength of tradition, a reminder of Britain's bond with the sea. Today, kippers have largely vanished from the weekday table, but in nostalgic corners they endure. To taste one is to step back into a Britain where the sea still decided what ended up on your plate. Black pudding, blood, fat, oats and spice, black pudding was not for the faint-hearted, but it was a cornerstone of the working man's diet. Made from pig's blood and offcuts, it was cheap, dense and packed with calories. In industrial towns, butchers turned waste into nourishment, crafting thick rings of pudding that sizzled in the pan. A slice at breakfast gave men the strength to face the factory floor or the mines. Served with fried eggs and bread, it was proof that nothing went unused. For many, the taste was an acquired one, rich and earthy. But for families scraping by, it was a lifeline, protein at a fraction of the price. Children grew up with it as normal, a part of the morning fry-up that stitched households together. Though modern tastes shy away, black pudding endures as both delicacy and memory. Once a necessity, it's now a heritage food, a reminder of thrift, ingenuity, and the toughness of Britain's working class. Peas pudding. Peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold. The nursery rhyme echoes an old reality. Made from split peas boiled down into a thick paste, peas pudding was the humble spread of the working man. Often cooked alongside a ham joint, it soaked up flavour and turned something plain into something hearty. Families slathered it on bread or ate it as a side with boiled potatoes. In the northeast, it became almost iconic, cheap, filling and reliable through generations of hardship. In factory towns, men carried it in tins or jars, a portable meal that fueled long shifts. Mothers passed down recipes, each with their own tweaks of seasoning or texture. Though today it's a rarity outside regional pockets, its memory lives on in rhyme, in song, and in kitchens that still prize thrift. Peas pudding wasn't glamorous, but it was nourishment that bound communities together, a working-class classic that sang of simplicity and survival. Jam roly-poly, a schoolboy's delight and a working man's comfort. Jam roly-poly was suet pastry rolled with jam, baked until golden, then drowned in custard. Simple, sweet and satisfying, it was the taste of childhood for many. Born in Victorian kitchens and popular through the 20th century, this pudding was cheap to make: flour, suet, sugar, and whatever jam the cupboard held. In working-class homes, it turned the end of a meal into something special, even if the main course had been plain. Men came home tired, boots heavy with coal dust or factory grime, and found a slice waiting, still steaming. For children, it was a rare treat, a moment when hardship seemed to soften. Though mocked later as school dinner fare, jam roly-poly endures in memory. The swirl of jam, the richness of custard, it wasn't elegance, but it was love on a plate. Liver and onions. Few dishes divided opinion like liver and onions. For some, its rich metallic flavour was a trial. For others, it was the taste of growing up. Either way, it was a working-class staple. Liver, or cheap, nutrient-dense, and often overlooked, was prized in times when every penny mattered. Fried with onions and served with mash and gravy, it turned offal into supper. For labourers, it meant iron and protein after long days that drained every ounce of energy. Children often balked at its strong flavour, noses wrinkling as the pan hissed. But mothers insisted, it'll put strength in you. And for many it did. Today, liver has slipped from most menus, but its memory lingers. In its day, it was more than food. It was medicine on the plate. The meal that kept working men on their feet and families fed against the odds. Toad in the hole. Despite the odd name, toad in the hole was pure comfort. Sausages baked in Yorkshire pudding batter until puffed and golden, drenched in onion gravy. A feast for little cost. The dish likely dates back to the 18th century when cooks stretched small amounts of meat with flour and eggs. For working-class families, it meant protein without breaking the budget. The sizzling sausages poking through the batter gave it its playful name, which children loved to repeat at the table. After long shifts, men tucked in, grateful for something warm and filling. For kids, it was excitement in a dish. Simple, cheap, but magical in its rise. Today, it's a nostalgic classic, sometimes dressed up in gastropubs, but always remembered best in its humble form. Hearty sausages, fluffy batter, and the laughter of families gathered round. Kedgeree, a dish with surprising roots, kedgeree came to Britain from colonial India, where rice, lentils, and spices blended into a simple meal. In Victorian times, it was reinvented with smoked fish, boiled eggs, and parsley, becoming a breakfast favourite. For the working man, it was less about empire and more about sustenance. Smoked haddock mixed with rice stretched further than meat. Eggs added protein, and a touch of spice gave warmth. It was practical, filling, and different from the usual bread and dripping routine. In coastal towns, kedgeree carried the smell of smokehouses and sea air. Men rising before dawn found it hearty enough to last through hours of toil. Families enjoyed it as a change from heavier pies and stews. Though it's less common today, its memory endures in kitchens where tradition and thrift meet. Kedgeree shows how the working class turned even foreign imports into fuel for daily life. Bread and dripping, the simplest of all and perhaps the most telling. Bread and dripping, a slice of bread spread not with butter, but with the cooled fat from Sunday's roast, often sprinkled with a little salt. For working men, it was the food of necessity. Meat was expensive, but the fat left behind became its own form of treasure. Children rushed to the table for the jelly layer beneath the fat, spread thick across crusty bread. It was breakfast, lunch, or a quick bite before heading back to work. Some saw it as poverty food, a sign of how little there was to go round. Others remembered it with fondness, the flavour of Sunday lingering into the week. Today, it's almost vanished, dismissed as unhealthy or unappealing. But for generations, bread and dripping was proof of resilience. That even scraps could be turned into sustenance, and sustenance into memory. Fish and chips, the hiss of batter hitting hot oil, the smell of vinegar filling the air, and the crinkle of newspaper in your hands. Fish and chips was Britain's original fast food. Cheap, filling, and always hot, it became the meal of the working class from the late 19th century onwards. Fried cod or haddock paired with thick-cut chips fed hungry factory workers and dockers. For pennies, you could leave work with a portion wrapped in yesterday's news, steam escaping into the night. It was food to eat on the walk home, food that didn't need plates or ceremony. For families, Friday night meant fish and chips carried through the door, children racing to peel back the paper. Salt stung the lips, vinegar perfumed the air, and bellies filled quickly. Today it's a national icon, but its roots lie in those cold working-class streets. Fish and chips wasn't luxury. It was necessity turned into ritual, a taste of joy at the end of hardship. Mince and tatties. In Scotland and beyond, mince and tatties was the dependable plate on every working class table. Minced beef simmered in gravy with onions and carrots ladled over boiled potatoes. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. This dish was about thrift. Mince stretched further than steak, potatoes were cheap, and gravy tied it all together. It was food you could make in one pot, after long hours of graft, with ingredients bought on the tightest budget. Children mashed tatties into gravy, adults soaked the last drops with bread. It wasn't glamorous or grits, but it filled bellies and brought everyone to the same table. Today it's remembered as the essence of homely cooking. Mince and tatties showed that meals didn't need polish to matter. They just needed warmth, flavour, and the company of those you loved. Cornish pasty. The Cornish pasty was the working man's lunchbox designed for miners deep underground. A thick pastry crust folded around beef, potato, swid and onion baked until golden. It was practical, portable and filling. Its clever design made it perfect. One half for savoury, sometimes the other filled with jam for pudding. The thick crimped edge wasn't just decoration. It gave miners a handle to hold with coal-stained hands, discarded after eating the clean inner layers. Whole communities depended on pasties. Wives prepared them at dawn, slipping them into tins that stayed warm through long shifts. For men working in dark, dangerous tunnels, the pasty was more than food. It was a piece of home in every bite. Though now a delicacy sold to tourists, its heart is still working class. The Cornish pasty wasn't designed for display. It was designed for survival, for nourishment, and for love carried in pastry. Cottage pie. Close cousin to shepherd's pie, cottage pie used minced beef instead of lamb. For many working families, it was the more affordable version, making it a weekly staple well into the 20th century. Layered beef, carrots and onions simmered in gravy, topped with mashed potato. It was a dish that stretched ingredients further and filled stomachs after a long day's work. The name itself came from the idea of humble cottage kitchens where resourceful mothers made something from very little. Children poked at the golden crust, scooping into the savoury filling with eager spoons. Fathers came home from shifts knowing a pie meant warmth, security and a full belly. Today it still lingers on family menus, but its meaning is rooted in memory. Cottage pie was never about elegance, it was about feeding the family, proof that comfort can come from the simplest of pots. Welsh rarebit. Despite its fancy name, Welsh rarebit was a humble dish of cheese, ale, mustard and spice, wilted into a thick sauce and poured over toast. For centuries it was a poor man's substitute for meat, but it became beloved in its own right. In coal mining towns and working class households, rarebit was the hearty supper that stretched a block of cheese into something that felt indulgent. The strong flavour, mixed with stale bread revived by heat, made it both affordable and satisfying. Families gathered around small fires, plates balanced on knees, the sharp tang of mustard and ale cutting through the richness. It wasn't grand, but it carried warmth, a rare treat in hard times. Today, Welsh rarebit is sometimes dressed up as pub fare, but its heart lies in simplicity. For the working man, it was proof that even a crust of bread and a bit of cheese could be transformed into something worth remembering. Bread and butter. Pudding. When bread went stale, the working class didn't throw it away. They transformed it into bread and butter pudding. Slices spread with butter, sprinkled with sugar, soaked in custard, and baked until golden. For many families, it was the dessert that stretched the week's rations. Cheap, filling, and comforting, it proved nothing needed to be wasted. The smell of nutmeg or cinnamon rising from the oven was enough to bring children running to the table. For working men, it was a rare sweetness at the end of long, bitter days. For mothers, it was ingenuity, turning scraps into something that felt like a treat. Today it's still a favourite in homes and pubs, though often forgotten among fancier desserts. Bread and butter pudding wasn't about indulgence, it was about making do and finding joy in the simplest ingredients. Ploughman's lunch. A hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, a slice of ham or pickle, and maybe an apple. The ploughman's lunch was rustic simplicity, born from the fields and pubs of working Britain. For centuries, farm workers carried these basics into the fields. It was food that needed no cooking, only a knife and a quiet corner to sit. Pubs later revived the dish, serving it with ale as a nod to tradition. For the working man, it was practical. Fuel carried in a pocket or satchel, shared under hedgerows or eaten on a stone wall between furrows. The sharpness of pickle, the chew of crusty bread, the salt of cheese. Together they felt complete. Today it's romanticised on pub menus, but its roots lie in dirt and sweat. The ploughman's lunch wasn't crafted for charm, it was built for survival, for simplicity, and for the honest hunger of men who work the land. Porridge. Before shifts began at dawn, many working men started with porridge. Oats boiled with water or milk. Sometimes with a pinch of salt, sometimes sweetened with a bit of treacle if luck allowed. Cheap and hearty, it was fuel for the body, warmth against the morning chill. In Scotland, it was stirred with a wooden spurtle, poured into bowls, and eaten standing before the day's work. For miners and labourers, it kept hunger at bay until midday. Children lined up at the table, steam rising from chipped bowls, their spoons clinking in unison. It was the rhythm of mornings, as familiar as the whistle of the factory horn. Today, porridge has become fashionable again, topped with fruit and honey. But its soul remains the same, plain, humble, and powerful enough to keep a man going from dawn to dusk. Suet dumplings. Few things warmed the bones like suet dumplings bobbing in a stew. Made from flour, suet and water, they swelled into soft, doughy clouds that turned thin broths into full meals. For working-class families, dumplings were the magic trick. They took the smallest bit of meat and vegetables and made it stretch to feed everyone. Dropped into bubbling pots, they absorbed gravy and fat, emerging as hearty belly-filling bites. Men came home from bitter cold to steaming bowls, dumplings heavy enough to satisfy after hours of labour. Children loved breaking them open, watching steam escape, soaking them in gravy until nothing was left. Today, dumplings are remembered with fondness, often tied to memories of winter kitchens and mothers stretching every ounce of food. They weren't elegant, but they were effective, proof that even flour and fat could comfort a whole household. Bacon butty, grease on the fingers, ketchup on the bread, and the unmistakable crunch of fried bacon. The bacon butty was the working man's breakfast on the go. Builders, dockers, and factory hands grabbed them from greasy spoons or packed them from home. Cheap white bread, butter, and bacon sizzling in the pan created something fast, salty, and perfect. Paired with a mug of strong tea, it was the fuel of Britain's workforce. On cold mornings, bacon butties warmed hands and bellies. The smell alone lifted spirits, a promise of energy before a long day's toil. Today, they're still sold in cafes and remembered with love. The bacon butty wasn't refined, but it didn't need to be. It was Britain in a sandwich. Simple, hearty, and impossible to forget. Scotch egg, an egg wrapped in sausage meat, coated in breadcrumbs and fried or baked until crisp. The Scotch egg was the perfect portable meal. Though its origins are debated, by the 20th century it had become a working man's snack found in pubs, picnics and lunchboxes. For labourers, it was practical. Protein, breading and flavour all in one compact package. Eaten cold or warm, it filled the stomach and required no cutlery, only a hungry hand. Wrapped in greaseproof paper, it was carried to job sites and enjoyed during short breaks. Children often marvelled at the cross-section, the golden yolk at the centre, the savoury meat around it. It was a small wonder in an otherwise ordinary day. Today, Scotch eggs are dressed up with gourmet twists, but their heart is humble. They weren't designed for elegance. They were built for hunger, for sustenance, and for a little bit of joy on the go. Steak and kidney pie. Rich, dark gravy, tender chunks of beef and kidney, and a pastry lid that shattered under the fork. Steak and kidney pie was the classic pub meal of the working man. Dating back to the 19th century, it turned cheap cuts and offal into something hearty and satisfying. In industrial towns, it was sold in pie shops and market stalls, warming hands through winter winds. At home, mothers baked them in battered tins, serving wedges with mash and peas. For working men, a slice of steak and kidney pie meant comfort after punishing shifts. It was indulgence, but never wasteful. Every part of the animal was used. Today, it stands as one of Britain's most iconic dishes. Steak and kidney pie wasn't just food. It was a tradition of thrift, warmth, and the belief that even the humblest ingredients could be turned into something magnificent. Fried herring in oatmeal. Before supermarkets and global imports, fish like herring fed working-class Britain. Rolled in oatmeal and fried until crisp, it was cheap, plentiful and nourishing. Coastal towns thrived on it, selling barrels of herring that travelled inland by rail. Families coated them in oats to stretch flavour and texture, frying them in shallow pans with a splash of dripping. The crackle in the pan was the sound of survival. For men, it was energy before long hours of toil. For children, it was often a test of taste, Strong, salty, but unforgettable. Today, fried herring has faded from daily life, replaced by more refined choices. But for generations, it was the taste of the sea brought to the table, proof of how Britain's working class made the most of what the coast could offer. Meat pudding. Long before ready meals, meat pudding was the centrepiece of the working class table. Suet pastry wrapped around minced beef, onions and gravy, steamed until dense and filling. It was heavy, yes, but that was the point. After 12 hours in a mine or factory, men needed weight, substance and staying power. The pudding provided all three. Families shared thick slices, ladled with whatever gravy could be scraped from the pan. The dish echoed resilience. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Just flour, fat and cheap meat transformed into a meal that could quiet the deepest hunger. Though it's rare today, those who grew up with it remember the solidity, the way it sat heavy but comforting, anchoring you after a hard day. Meat pudding wasn't just food, it was survival disguised as tradition. Full English breakfast, the crown jewel of the working man's menu, the full English breakfast, bacon, sausages, eggs, beans, black pudding, mushrooms, tomatoes, and toast, a plate so loaded it could carry a man through an entire day. It became popular during the Industrial Revolution, when labour demanded immense energy. Factory workers, miners and farmers alike sat down to breakfast that piled the table high. It was calorie-dense, greasy and glorious. The sizzle of bacon in the pan, the rich smell of fried bread, the crack of eggs. It was a morning ritual that defined Britain's working class. Families gathered before dawn, eating together before men set off and children hurried to school. Over time, it became a national symbol offered in greasy spoons and cafes on every high street. Today, it's often treated as indulgence, a weekend treat rather than a necessity. But in its heyday, the full English wasn't luxury. It was fuel, pride and comfort, a plate that reminded working men that whatever the day demanded, they'd face it with strength. Which of these meals takes you straight back to your childhood? Share your memories in the comments, because these weren't just meals, they were pieces of our lives worth keeping alive.